To create, cascade and instill a culture within an organization requires change management. But the interesting thing about change management is actually an oxymoron. What is an oxymoron? Two contradictory ideas that exist in the same sentence. So why is change management an oxymoron? Because you cannot manage change. In fact, very often, change manages us. And part of the challenges we have in instituting changes is that we try and manage the change instead of focusing on what's going to enable the new change to happen effectively, and that is the transition. Now, when we focus just on the change, you have your change agent who is imposing a change within an organization. And by doing that, it often leaves out the change recipient. And when you don't involve the change recipient in the process, it creates alienation and disengagement. And when a person feels alienated and disengaged, it invites a whole lot of unattractive behaviors that hurt the organization, but also hurts the change being implemented effectively. So for a change to happen effectively and sustainably, we have to focus on something that is often overlooked, and that's the relationship between the change agent and the change recipient. And that relationship, and managing that relationship, we call nurturing transition. And if we nurture a transition, then the change happens much more effectively, much more speedily, and very importantly, much more meaningfully and more sustainable. Now, one of the key reasons we don't manage the transition or nurture the transition is because very often we're not equipped how. Now, nurturing the transition has two components. What happens intrapsychically, what goes on inside of us, and also what happens interpersonally, what happens between ourselves and other people. And if we understand that, then we know how to manage people through the change effectively. To begin the process of nurturing the transition, we have to understand one very important psychological concept known as mentalization. Now, they did an experiment on 3- and 4-year-olds, and they got these 3- and 4-year-olds to watch a play. And in the play, there was a young girl by the name of Sally that walked onto the stage pushing a stroller, and in the stroller was a doll. She left it there and she walked off. Unbeknown to her, Anne walked onto the stage, and she took the doll out of the stroller and she hid it under a couch. And then she walked off the stage. Sally came back onto the stage and they froze the play. They stopped the play. And they asked the children, the 3- and 4-year-olds, where will Sally look for the doll? Now that was very interesting because the 3- and 4-year-olds gave two different answers. The 3-year-old said, Sally will look for the doll under the couch. The 4-year-old said she will look in the stroller. So what is the difference between the 3- and 4-year-olds? The 3-year-olds can only see the world through their eyes. The doll is there, and so that's where they go. Everyone in the world is going to look, and they can only see it through their eyes. The 4-year-olds were able to what we call mentalize. They were able to access Sally's world. They were able to engage Sally's world and put the pieces of the puzzle together and recognize, hold on, Sally was not on the stage when Anne came onto the stage and took the doll out of the stroller. So obviously she's not going to know that that's what happened, so she will look in the stroller. And the 4-year-olds could put all of those pieces of the puzzle together and they could understand Sally's world. Now what mentalization does, it allows us to understand the intentionality behind people's behavior. It helps us understand why people do what they do. Now, if we want to nurture transition, that skill is critical. We cannot go around and engage in a big culture or change management process and operate like 3-year-olds and only see it through our lens. In fact, for any change to be successful, we've got to operate through the lens of a 4-year-old. And that means engaging both the world of other and our own world. In order to nurture transition effectively, we've got to focus on two very important components. One, what happens inside of us, what we call intrapsychically, and mentalization is part of that understanding. And the second thing is what happens interpersonally with people through change. And to understand what people go through from a psychological perspective in change, it's very important actually to start off with our own relationships. And if you look at your own relationship, perhaps any intimate relationship that you've been involved in, it always starts in romantic love, where you think this is fantastic. The person that you're involved with, you love the way they talk, the way they walk, the way they eat. Every single thing they do is absolutely fantastic. And this lasts for a period of time, perhaps a year, 1.5 years. And then at some point it changes. And from romantic love, it hits the power struggle. And in fact, the very things that you liked about them, suddenly you dislike. You don't like the way they walk, the way they talk, the way they eat. And you've now entered into this phase of the power struggle, and there's 5 stages in the power struggle. The first one is shock, where both parties in this relationship think, wow, how did this happen? How did it move from being so fantastic to so terrible? But psychologically, you can't remain in shock forever, so what happens is you go to the next phase, and that is denial. And in denial, both parties think to themselves, you know what, this is normal. All couples go through this. And they run to exclusive books and they buy Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And they say, you see, we're not supposed to get on. But psychologically, you cannot remain in denial forever. So you go to the next stage, which is anger. And there's 2 types of anger. There's overt and covert anger. Overt anger, a lot more screaming, shouting. Covert anger, you punish each other in passive-aggressive ways. Burn each other's food, add salt when the other person doesn't like salt, and you punish each other that way. But again, you can't stay in anger forever, so you're going to bargaining, and bargaining is what we call the beginning of the end, where you start to develop exits. And there's 3 types of exits. There's moral exits, there's immoral exits, and there's severe exits. But after exits is despair. And in despair, the statistics start to play a role. And we find that 67% of couples don't make it. 28% lead a parallel existence. So they stay together and they've given up that it gets better, but they just coexist. A small percentage, 5%, actually make it. Now this is very interesting because sadly we were never told that the power struggle is normal. They didn't tell us that you're going to move out of romantic love into the power struggle, and you will go through the power struggle, and it's normal. So if you don't know it's normal, of course you're going to leave, because you didn't sign up for that. But they also didn't tell us something else. They didn't tell us that there's another phase after the power struggle, and that's called a conscious relationship. And what the conscious relationship is dialogue. And if you can manage the power struggle through dialogue, and there's a toolkit for the conscious relationship, then what you do is you recreate romantic love. But this time, it's much more on a solid footing. So why is this relevant to change? Because this is precisely what goes on in organizations. It can happen when you start a new job, you start in romantic love. What a fantastic boss I have, what a fantastic colleagues I have. And then 2 months later, you hate your boss and you hate your colleagues because you've hit the power struggle. And in the power struggle, you're going to go through those various phases as I've described. But with reference to change, that's exactly what happens. Is change takes us out of romantic love and puts us into the power struggle. And the people going through the change recipients, are going to go through shock and anger, shock, denial, anger, bargaining, and perhaps exits. And as leaders and managers, if we can be aware of that and know how to manage people through the power struggle, we can, and that's through the conscious relationship, we can recreate romantic love and have a much more engaged workforce. So when we're trying to create a new culture within an organization, you must understand we run the risk of taking people out of their comfort zone, out of romantic love, into the power struggle, and we mustn't see this as negative. We must see it as there is a toolkit that can help manage these people through the transition. And by doing that, then the that we set out to create in the beginning becomes much more sustainable because people have understood it, been supported through the challenge, and now see the value of the change.